Welcome to the British Computer Society, the Chester and North Wales branch. We're happy to have you all with us. We have a monthly meeting, we have a monthly presentation, second Wednesday of every month, so everyone's welcome to join us. And in this particular one, we've got Tony Pitchford and Gordon Richardson doing a presentation on apprenticeships. Now, Gordon has been an apprenticeship training provider in England for, well, working in the region anyway for about 20 years, and he's a member of our committee. Whereas Tony is a key account manager for apprenticeships in BCS HQ. So, gents, I shall hand over to yourselves for the presentation.
Thank you. What we'll do is I'll keep my camera off until I've finished the presentation and hand over to Gordon, and then we'll kind of put the cameras back on, ready for our Q&A at the end of the session. So I'm just going to switch my camera off. So good evening, everyone. As David said, my name is Tony Pitchford. I'm a key account manager at BCS. I specialise in the area of apprenticeships. And I've worked for a number of training providers, colleges, universities over the past 15 years, particularly in and around digital and IT apprenticeship programs. I joined BCS about 4 years ago as BCS entered the market as an endpoint assessment organisation. And what we're going to look at today is just a little bit of an overview on setting up an apprenticeship program and running an apprenticeship program, and a little bit about the role of BCS as an endpoint assessment organisation, the role of the training provider, how that all fits together with you as the employer, and what support is available for you. So there's a slide in here. I am from BCS. I'm talking to people from BCS, so apologies if I'm teaching you a little bit here to suck eggs. But you know that BCS is an organisation covering a broad range of skills, backgrounds across a number of countries. You can see over 150 countries in there. What we're looking at here is why take on an apprentice? You know, what is it that an apprentice will give to you as a business, as an employer? Well, there's a huge amount of research available, and I've put some links at the back end of this presentation to talk about, so for you to follow up and kind of do some further research or look into it further if you want to. But there are some figures on the National Apprenticeship Service website that show that 86% of employers said that apprentices had helped them develop, I beg your pardon, skills relevant to their organisation. So this is a great way to develop skills internally that add value to your organisation. Not only that, nearly 80% who were surveyed said that apprentices help them improve their overall productivity. So there is a little bit of a myth that if you take on an apprentice, a lot of your time is going to be spent supporting that apprentice. It's not strictly true, and certainly the data doesn't show that. What it shows is that taking on an apprentice might take you a little bit longer to get that person up to speed, but overall, over the duration of that apprenticeship, that person will become as productive and add value as any other employer would do, any other employee would do. And it also drove quality. Apprentices are driven by trying to meet the requirements of a set of standards that have been designed by employers. And when they do that, they are looking at different aspects of your business, of your processes, they ask questions, and therefore drive quality. If you've got people looking over your shoulder asking, why do you do that all the time? It forces you to ask the same question, and it drives your productivity, it drives your quality up. So taking on an apprentice is a great way of adding value to your business. There are other channels to recruit people from, but the value of an apprentice is that they are going to be driven to ask the right questions of you. Not always at the right time, but they will ask the right questions of you. One final point on this: working with a good training provider will mean that the kind of training that's delivered for your apprentice can be adapted to meet your needs. And there are various ways that you can do that, and sure, Gordon will cover or can talk a little bit more about that later on. So there will be things that can be delivered as part of the apprenticeship program that really enhance the kind of training and skills requirements that you have as a business. So they can be very flexible. They're not kind of fixed routes. it's a great way to expand and upskill your workforce and as I said, drive improvement in quality and productivity. But the big question is where to get started. It's a tricky one. To do this, I've boiled this down to a really simple set of steps, but there, obviously there are other bits to this. But the first steps to get a business off the ground with an apprenticeship is to create an apprenticeship account. You can do that on the National Apprenticeship Service website. If your organisation pays the levy, which means you've got a salary bill over £3 million a year on your PAYE, then you're automatically making a contribution towards a levy pot, which is yours for the next 2 years. It kind of accrues over a 2-year period. So whatever you put into that pot within that 2-year period, you can draw from to create an apprenticeship. But you automatically have an account on the National Apprenticeship Service if you pay into the levy. If you're a smaller business, you are now also obliged to create an account on the Apprenticeship Service website. And then your next step, and probably the biggest step for most employers, is to find the right partner to work with who's going to deliver the training for you, to work with a training provider. They will work with you to write up the kind of role that your apprentices are going to be doing, and to map that and match that against the appropriate apprenticeship standard, so that you know that the apprentice that's in that role can gather evidence and build a portfolio that meets the requirement of the apprenticeship standard. Now, you may already have a pre-existing job description, you may already have a job in mind, and so part of the role of the apprenticeship training provider will be to assess that job description and come up with any kind of concerns or gap analysis where the apprentice may need to do a secondment or a placement to make sure that they get the full depth and breadth of the apprenticeship experience that's required of them under the apprenticeship standards. Beyond that, it's advised that you look at what support is going to be needed in the workplace. Whether that's a direct line manager who will also act as a mentor, whether you've got peer mentoring. Microsoft have a wonderful scheme which is executive mentoring, where the apprentice actually mentors a senior executive and shadows a senior executive within their own organization. And that goes all the way to the top. So the chief executive of Microsoft EMEA, I can't remember the lady's name, it's completely gone from my mind there, but she is shadowed by an apprentice once or twice a month who attends all of the meetings with her and then gives her feedback at the end of the day. So you could look at lots of different and interesting ways to look after your apprentice, to broaden their experiences, but ultimately their role will be defined by the job description you give them, by the apprenticeship standard they're working towards, and the support you put in place. And it's that third piece which is really important in the workplace. Do they have a direct line manager who's going to look after them? Do they have a mentoring or peer support around them to help them grow and develop? And then you go to market. Again, some training providers will already have a talent pool available for you to recruit from. You may want to put existing members of staff onto an apprenticeship program to help upskill your existing workforce. Or you could go to market and recruit either in partnership with your provider, which is the kind of very common route, or go out and find your own apprentice that matches your requirements. How you do that is typically down to a conversation with the training provider that you're working with and your individual requirements. But it's no different to going out to market in a lot of instances. There is a job board available on the government website, which is dedicated to apprentices, targets particularly young people. But you'll also find adverts on things like Indeed and Monster and other sites, such as Not Going to Uni or Career Map, where apprenticeships are very commonly advertised. And you'll go through the usual recruitment processes to recruit and select them. Once you have that apprentice in place, you're then looking at putting them through and starting them off on the apprenticeship journey. So you as the employer have a role to support that apprentice with on-the-job training for 80% of the time that they're on their apprenticeship. Some of you may not have apprentices already. Some of you may be a little bit more familiar with them. An apprenticeship will last anywhere between about 12 to 13 months up to 30 to 36 months, depending on the apprenticeship standard that they're on. But 80% of their time during their apprenticeship is what's classed as on-the-job training. That's actually carrying out the roles and responsibilities that they're training to do, so actually doing the job. Or it's on secondment, but it's effectively doing the job. That 20% off the job training is typically directed by the training provider in agreement with you as to what the off the job training looks like. Now, it could be attending training courses, it could be writing up work towards their portfolio, it could be writing up work that they're doing or preparing for exams. It could be revision and that kind of activity, but it's also reflective learning or personal development. So there's a whole mix of things that can be considered off the job training. Again, it's fantastic advice on the ESFA website as to what's classed as off the job training. It's not as daunting as it might seem to fill 20% of someone's time purely with training and development. There are lots of activities that will count towards it, but that's part and parcel of your role. And the training provider, again, their role is to help direct that and to provide the additional training support that goes with your apprentices. The role of BCS as an endpoint assessment organisation, indeed the role of any endpoint assessment organisation, is to independently assess the competency of the apprentice against the requirements of a document known as the standard, the Apprenticeship Standard, that everybody is working towards. We don't write the standard as an endpoint assessment organisation. It's a group of employers called a Trailblazer Group working under the Institute for Apprenticeships. Somebody somewhere has a bright idea that we really need a DevOps engineer level 4 apprenticeship program because they've got a really burning need for it. And they're passionate enough about DevOps, for example, to want to put their shoulder to the wheel and create an apprenticeship program. And that's what happened. We now have a DevOps level 4 engineer program available to us as an apprenticeship standard that was driven by a group of employers that were enthusiastic enough about the world of DevOps to create an apprenticeship standard that describes a job description in broad terms. What would somebody working at level 4 do in the role of a DevOps engineer? And we can now offer that as an apprenticeship program. And that's how this works. Our job is to view the evidence from each apprentice and assess whether or not that evidence meets the requirements that were set by that Trailblazer group. So we're independent of the training provider, we're independent of you as the employer, we're directed and driven by the requirements that have been described by that Trailblazer group for that particular job role. That's what we do as an endpoint assessment organisation. That endpoint assessment is independent, but that doesn't mean that there isn't support available. So there are events like this. There are lots of work that we do with training providers to keep them informed of the requirements of the apprenticeship programs and coaching and training that we deliver to training providers. And we also run sessions with employers to engage with them and to keep them informed as to what an apprenticeship looks like and how things work. And this is one small part of that whole kind of inform and educate and support piece. But you as the employer get to choose which endpoint assessment organisation you work with. I would hope that, given that I'm talking to people who have a vested interest in BCS, that you may well choose BCS as your digital endpoint assessment organisation, but it is your choice as the employer who you work with. And their role is to assess independently what's required. Just to give you a little bit of context about the digital apprenticeship market at the moment, BCS accounts for a huge percentage of the apprenticeship market to date. We've completed, since 2017, when we did our first endpoint assessment, we've completed over 11,500 endpoint assessments. So that's apprentices who've been through 12, 18, 24 months worth of training and development in the workplace, who then come to BCS and go through an endpoint assessment process with us. I'll talk about the endpoint assessment process in a little bit later on. And you can see there how many apprentices we've got registered with us, how many knowledge modules. Some of the apprenticeship programs historically require on-program exams as part and parcel of that. Now that could be, in some circumstances, a Microsoft or a CompTIA exam. it could be that it was a BCS exam. You can see the kind of scale of the work that we've been doing. You know, nearly 50,000 exams from BCS have been taken to date. The new versions of the standards don't have that set exam requirement, so there have been a few changes recently, but there are still apprentices going through the final version, or the kind of the current versions of the apprenticeship programs that will need to complete those exams before they finish up. So it's quite a run rate of exams that we offer. What apprenticeship standards are out there? You can see from the table here, you've got a good range of apprenticeship programs, and there are also different levels of apprenticeship. So, for example, the AI Data Specialist Apprenticeship is at level 7. That's equivalent to a master's degree, an MSc, or you've got things like IT technical salesperson or digital marketer at level 3. That's roughly equivalent to doing A levels in those areas. And level 4 apprenticeships, digital community manager, network engineer, data analyst, DevOps, for example, those apprenticeships are around the equivalent of an HNC foundation degree type level, if that gives you some kind of idea as to where these apprenticeships are pitched. What I'd like to do is just take a quick moment just to have a look at one or two of these apprenticeship programs. Now, I have a caveat here, which is that I'm not going to spend too long on this. I will share the slide deck with the organisers to share with you. Each of the tiles on that particular slide are linked to the Apprenticeship Standards, so you can have a look for yourself if there's a particular discipline there that you feel is of interest to you. The slide, if someone could just confirm that you can actually see the IFA website for me, please, just so that I can, just a quick wave of a hand or a nod on a microphone somewhere would be great.
That's fine, Tony.
Perfect, thank you. So the apprenticeship standard I've pulled up is the is the Information Communications Technician standard, the ICT level 3. This is a very new standard. It was only released in May. It was designed to replace an apprenticeship standard that it was felt needed a bit of a refresh. So we now have this ICT level 3. It's replacing actually our most popular product, the Infrastructure Technician level 3 apprenticeship standard. What you'll find in each of the apprenticeship documents, in each of the apprenticeship standards, if you have a look on the IFA website, is there's generally a description of the kind of role that the apprentices will be in. This one happens to be very, very detailed. There's a lot of information on this one. And it then breaks down 3 categories of duties that the apprentice needs to be able to evidence, need to be able to show BCS as an endpoint assessment organisation at the end of their apprenticeship what they have done to meet these requirements, to actually show that they can do this part of the job in detail. So you can see the first duty there is to provide technical support to customers, internal and external, through a range of communication. And you have these broken down into K, S, and B categories: knowledge, skills, and behaviours. So if I click on K7, for example, we can see at the top of the page, K7 is the principles of cultural awareness and diversity and how that impacts on the delivery of support tasks. So your apprentice needs to have an awareness of cultural sensitivity when they're dealing with customers, internal or external, as part of their day-to-day duties. On a more technical level, let's have a look at skill number 4. So operating safely and securely, but you can see how these skills, for example, undertake basic software upgrades physically or remotely. You can see how these duties from a technical help desk type role or an IT support type role, first line support, where these duties would fit in. Now, this is an interesting standard in that it's broken down into 3 separate categories. One is support technician, network technician, and digital communications technician. So if you're working in an environment that needs to offer unified comms support, the digital communications technician track is more appropriate than perhaps someone working in a first-line help desk role, where the support technician track is a better fit for their job description. So this is all about tailoring the apprenticeship delivery to your job role and the job that you're trying to fill with the apprenticeship. Any of selecting any of those will give you a different set of KSBs that of knowledge, skills, and behaviours. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, but yeah, knowledge, skills, and behaviours that the apprentice needs to evidence. That fundamentally will give you an understanding of where the job description that you have in mind matches the apprenticeship that your training provider is going to want you to deliver, and we're going to assess as your endpoint assessment against it. And you can also, if you want to go down that particular rabbit hole, click on this document here, and that will show you the assessment plan that BCS is required to follow to ensure that your apprentice meets those requirements. But we won't go down that one because that's a good 30-page document, and it's no fun to watch that one being presented. In terms of the endpoint assessment itself, though, that is really, really interesting for us, because with the revised version of the Apprenticeship Standards that came out this month, and also some of the standards that have been released over the past 8 or 9 months, we're seeing a really interesting progression of how BCS is required to work with employers and work with training providers to assess your apprentices. In that each assessment process has now been tailored to meet the job role requirements that you have. So for example, a cybersecurity technician at level 3, they or even at level 4, will be required to demonstrate in a live scenario how they would respond to a threat, so that an assessor can observe the processes that they would follow and the actions that they take in response to a live situation. And so we'll set up a simulation for that to happen. We'll set up a project for that to happen. The assessor will observe it, and will then come back with some technical questions to investigate why they made particular decisions, why they acted in a particular way, what processes they felt they were following, and to kind of discuss their approach as part of that scenario demonstration. They will also have to be able to demonstrate technical knowledge through a series of tests. And in addition to that, during their apprenticeship, they will have built up a portfolio of evidence to show their competencies against the knowledge, skills, and behaviours. So you can see how, from a cyber point of view, you want people who are able to act calmly under pressure, to be able to follow the right protocol and processes, and to be able to demonstrate a good, solid level of technical knowledge and understanding that they can respond to in sometimes quite high pressure situations. That, I think, accurately reflects the kind of role that someone working in a cybersecurity environment would work in. You flip that over to the DevOps engineer that I mentioned earlier on. That's a much more holistic approach to an endpoint assessment. Here, the DevOps engineer has a 4-month period to complete a DevOps project that is a real-life project in the workplace, so it's something that adds value to you as a business if they're working within your organization, and they are assessed based on the outcome of that project. There is a live assignment that they have to show a live release of software, for example, but again, that would be investigated and discussed, a technical discussion with an assessor from BCS to ensure that they've followed the right processes and protocols. So the endpoint assessment process mirrors the kind of work that the apprentices will be doing in the workplace for you. So they're very, very cleverly designed. Historically, endpoint assessment was a kind of one-size-fits-all. Everybody went through the same process to get assessed. And now we're seeing these very nuanced, quite sympathetic kind of endpoint assessment processes that we're following that are going to be a really good match for the requirements of each of the apprenticeship roles that are out there. So again, thinking about this from a BCS point of view, thinking about this just from what is going to work for you as an employer, I think it's key that we think about what do you want from an apprentice. When you're taking somebody on, you always start with the end in mind. That's what you'll hear that a lot from endpoint assessment organizations. of course, we're going to say start with the end in mind. We're the endpoint assessment organisations. We're the bit that happens at the end. But what you want as an employer is a trusted IT professional. So what BCS has done is we've tried to map the requirements of the endpoint assessment process against the occupational standards that exist within the digital sector. So completing an endpoint assessment through BCS automatically entitles the apprentice to sign up for our IT Tech, the Register for IT Technicians, and that also gives them 12 months membership of BCS free of charge so that they can get familiar with the requirements of being a professional, having letters after their name, joining in these kinds of networking groups, getting involved in these kinds of events, encouraging them to take up membership, and also accessing the mentors and everything else that you get as part of being a BCS member. So we are encouraging them as much as possible to think of themselves as trusted IT professionals and to use the endpoint assessment as a springboard, into that kind of professional environment, into that trusted professional environment. And that's, demonstrating their competency has been done in spades during the endpoint assessment, and we've assessed against that. And if they pass, then we believe that they meet the requirements for our IT Tech and for BCS membership. So they get that as a kind of freebie at the end of their apprenticeship program. Again, all the benefits that go with your business as well when that happens. Now, I've touched a lot on the kind of what happens in England from an apprenticeship point of view and the endpoint assessment process. I'm going to hand over to Gordon, but as I did say, there are a couple of links there just for you to have a look at. I'll come back on later on to do a Q&A, and Gordon's going to entertain us now by saying next slide please to me, because we've just missed that over the last few months and weeks, haven't we? So over to you, Gordon.
Next slide please, Tony. Diolch yn fawr iawn, croeso Gymru. Thank you very much. Welcome to my part of the slideshow. So yes, as Tony said, I'll be talking about the Welsh slant on apprentices. I think it's actually important to really understand though and be aware that regardless of where you are in the UK, the actual delivery or the intent for apprenticeships is pretty much the same. It's to ensure that we've got training that can be adapted to meet the needs of business, whilst also sort of developing and motivating apprentices and getting them to learn new skills. Tony mentioned about having that I suppose you would think about it at home. You would have the little one going, why? It's a little bit like that, as Tony said, having an apprentice. They're almost like your critical friend, so they'll be talking to you saying, why are you doing it that way? With them having maybe slightly different view on life, you can get new ideas on how to do things yourself. You're never too old to learn, as they say. I'll talk a little bit about how the system used to work in England before Apprenticeship Standards came in, because it has a relevance with regards to Wales. So in England, the qualifications were made up. You had a knowledge-based qualification, you had a competence-based qualification, so think MVQ from that side of things. There was transferable skills, which is effectively English, maths, and for the ICT, which was used for our sector, or equivalent qualifications. So some A levels and international qualifications also classed towards transferable skills. And then they had something called personal learning and thinking skills, which was getting the apprentice to think about being an independent inquirer, creative thinking, reflecting on their learning, understanding how they work as part of the team, thinking about effective participation, so how do they work within your organization, and also sort of the self-management area, how do they look after themselves, how do they drive themselves. Off the back of that, there was also something called employee rights and responsibilities, which was a very useful area because what it allowed the apprentices to learn about is actually what are their rights within the workplace. Anything from health and safety law to understanding their rights around leave, around sickness, and also looking at career progression. Where are they going to move on to? What's their life plan? So it helped them work towards that. And all that was covered by a piece of legislation called SACE, which was the specification of apprenticeship standards for England. You mentioned that, I said there for England, and yes, we actually had and have a version for Wales. So we've got the specification of apprenticeship standards for Wales, SASW, which effectively sets out what must be contained within an apprenticeship programme. So Tony, next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the apprenticeships, they are made up of a number of units at different levels. So an apprentice could come in starting off their career with a foundation apprentice, which is level 2. And Tony alluded to this earlier. So the level 2 side of things would be effectively a GCSE equivalent. Now, I'd be shocked by other members of the education and training world that sort of try and compare vocational qualifications to sort of mainstream qualifications, because they're a totally different way of learning, but bear with us. So level 2 equivalent to GCSE, level 3, as Tony said, was A level. And then you've got your level 4, your higher apprentices, 4, 5, 6, and 7s, which you sort of go over to your master's side of things. For each, there we are. Just trying to breathe. So for each of the levels, there are a set number of credits that a learner has to achieve. Okay, so we follow something called the Credit and Qualification Framework for Wales. So for a level 2, they need a minimum of 78 credits. For level 3, 114, and for a level 4, you're looking at 218 credits. With regards to the framework that I'm talking about, which is the IT Web Telecoms Professional, which is the one that sort of suits our industry, it goes up as far as level 4. So Tony mentioned a little bit about the funding side of things. Things are slightly different in Wales, as you'd expect. So if you are a levy payer in England, some of the money accrued from the levy is transferred over to the devolved nations to help them support apprenticeships. Plus, they also put their own money aside as well. So if you are delivering an apprenticeship programme in Wales, there is government funding to support it, and there's a set amount for each level of qualification, and that's paid on a monthly basis. And you work in partnership with a training provider to sort the funding out for those elements. Just before I move on, you can see there that you've got the level 2, level 3, and level 4. And I mentioned the sort of the minimum number of credits for each one. The idea is that you could start at a level 2, and then there is progression to level 3 and to level 4, and the requirements get more complex as you go up the higher levels, as you would expect. So typically a level 2 apprentice would be working, maybe doing some repetitive work. It's more of a technician level. And they would be given tasks. Level 3 is more of your engineer side of things, so they're expected to be more technically minded, actually going in and doing investigations, and they may even sort of supervise level 2 apprentices, in time. And level 4 is more for your senior, your principal engineers and your managers side of things. So you can see how there's progression going up from the different levels. So Tony, if you can move over, next slide. Thank you very much. So the next slide then, we're talking about the actual IT software web telecom professional qualification I mentioned earlier. And for that, it's been set out in the specification that there are 5 elements that must be completed. There is a knowledge qualification. Now, if you remember, Tony was saying that there was knowledge, there were skills, and there was behaviour within the apprenticeship standards. So you can see there is some sort of comparison between them. It's just that the way that they're delivered. So there's a knowledge qualification, and this will typically be delivered either by a college, so you may partner with a college, or you may have a training provider that you're working with who can provide that requirement to give your apprentice the knowledge that they need. But they will also need knowledge probably from yourselves with regards to how you work and maybe some of the specialties within your organisation. So a typical qualification there would be maybe a level 2, level 3 or level 4 diploma in ICT systems and principles. Typically there's about 40 odd units that you could select from the catalogue of units, but you would only need a set number, or maybe it's typically about 6 units that you would need to be able for the apprentice to complete the knowledge elements. And so these are assessed either by a training provider or by college. Also with the knowledge qualifications, you can have vendor qualifications in some instances that can go towards providing the knowledge, and they will actually be one of the units that you would potentially select depending on what you want your apprentice to do. The competence qualification. So this is the out there, the doing, actually proving what they can do. The evidence for this will either come from them writing reflective accounts, people providing witness testimonies to what they're doing, or they'll have an assessor who will come out into the workplace and actually sit there and observe them, what they're doing, asking them questions, just trying to see what they're doing, how they're doing it, and then they will mark them off against a series of competence requirements. So that's the job of the assessor that you would have coming in from your training provider. Within the competence elements, there are 2 mandatory qualifications. You've got health and safety, because we all need to make sure that our apprentices are safe at all times. And there's also one which is develop own effectiveness and professionalism, which sorts of gets them thinking about what they want with their career. How do they become competent and professional in the way, in their attitudes to working? How do they work with other people? So there's a specific unit on that one. And again, the complexity goes up, whether it's a level 2, level 3 or level 4. Because obviously if you're sort of level 4, you're going to need some sort of negotiation skills around there as well. So it all sort of links in and gets them thinking about their career. There's about 70 odd competence units. From the optional side of things that you can choose, and this really allows you to tailor the apprenticeship to your organization. Now I can just give you a couple of the titles here. So for example, working with ICT hardware and equipment, quite generic, but obviously you can dial that down into your own organization. Or fault finding is another one. As if you've got a technician, you'd want them to be able to develop fault finding techniques. So, there would be an assessment around doing that. Again, there's 70 odd for you to choose from, depending on your organization's requirements. We've also got the essential skills, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the differences within Wales. So we've got communication skills, we've got application of number, and we've got digital literacy. When I mentioned with regards to in England, they had English, they had maths, and they had ICT. In Wales, there's a slightly different slant on it, trying to make it more sort of practical and applicable to the Welsh requirements. Interestingly, there isn't a requirement there for the Welsh language. But they also need to achieve on and off the job training a set amount of hours. Tony mentioned that there's having an apprentice is an investment. So you need to be prepared as an employer to be able to allow them time to do their learning. One thing that I found with experience is that yes, there's an initial sort of supporting an apprentice, but usually after about 6 months, the apprentice is becoming quite effective in their role. And there's a limit, there's I'm not sure it's an issue, but you have to be careful that people don't forget that the individual is an apprentice and they are still learning, because quite often they can just be brought in as part of the team and tasked accordingly. But if you think about the on and off the job training required for a level 2 qualification, they need 310 hours of on and off the job training. Okay, that goes up to 510 hours for a level 3. and 1,010 hours for a level 4 qualification. In England, with the standards, it's just classed as 20% off the job. So 20% of their time they have to have off the job. But in Wales, there's specific number of hours that an apprentice needs to be afforded to be able to gain the knowledge and understanding to be able to do their role. And again, Tony alluded to this earlier. So if you think about the typical roles, so a level 2 qualification, we're looking at things like support technician, website administrators, so a help desk professional. Level 3, you're sort of maybe looking at a software developer or desktop support engineers or network planners, that side of things. Note, there are similar titles within the standards that you saw that Tony showed earlier. And level 4, potentially, you're looking at IT project managers. You may be looking at analysts and developers, security analysts, telecoms managers, and that type of role. So hopefully that from those roles that I've spoken about, you could see that there could be potentially a route from level 3 and then they progress in their career. So they could start off as a support technician, go up to a support engineer, and then look at being a telecoms manager. So we can see how their career, how they could map their career out as it goes on. So pretty much that's it from me. Just the next slide will just give you information. So within Wales, if you go to Careers Wales, there's a section there on apprenticeships. It will tell you there all that you need to know about being an employer of an apprentice. It also tells the apprentices what they will need to do, potentially what life is like being an apprentice. But really your first start, at Careers Wales, would be able to put you in touch with an apprentice training provider in Wales delivering the Welsh apprenticeships. So that's it from me. I suppose the next slide is we're over to questions, I believe.
Okay, yeah, if anyone's got any questions, please just type them in, but I've got one or two to start off with. So I was just wondering, I did an apprenticeship 35 years ago. I was just wondering, how do the new apprenticeships compare to the modern day ones? There seems to be a lot more assessments and stuff going on there.
I suppose it's still a job with training at its heart. The apprenticeships have never changed around that. I think where the new apprenticeship standards in England have come through, they have very much focused on, I think you can see straight away there, the apprenticeship system as it was in England, as it still is in Wales, has a kind of a single apprenticeship framework with lots of different moving parts inside of it. That you can fit a job role against it, and if there are some bits missing, then there are areas where you could train up against it, and it's a I suppose in that sense, Gordon, you might agree or disagree that there's a certain degree of flexibility within that model. That means if your job role isn't an exact fit, there are things that you could do around that would enable you to complete or put an apprentice in role regardless. Whereas in England, it's not so much prescriptive. I think it's much more about defining the job role and having that apprenticeship standard aligned to it. I think where the significant differences that I've seen over the past kind of 10, 15 years is really that drive to have an independent overview of the role by companies like BCS, by organizations like BCS, where your skills and your competencies are validated independently of the people that you've been working with or the people that you've been trained by. So yeah, so there's that kind of slightly removed assessment piece, but it's all matched against a very specific job role. As Gordon said, you could do the IT, web and telecoms framework and be a network engineer, or you could be a first-line help desk role, or you could be a software developer, or you could be in unified comms. You're still doing effectively the same apprenticeship and come out with the same certificate at the end of it by building up those credits. Whereas in England, these are very, very role-specific apprenticeship programs. And we've gone from, I think there was something, Gordon, again, correct me if I'm wrong, think there's something like 600 different apprenticeship standards in England now. So there are more apprenticeships than there are job sick codes now. So yeah, the range of very specific apprenticeships has just exploded in the past 5 or 6 years.
I would also say that looking at the way the apprenticeships have changed, probably, David, from your perspective, it was almost as it is now, where your assessment was continuous. That's the thing with frameworks. It's continuous assessment. So you'll do it through college out for the knowledge elements, or with your training provider, and certainly with the competence side of things, your progress, your ability is being assessed constantly by your dedicated assessor. Whereas with apprenticeship standards, the assessment is all end loaded.
Yeah.
So it's very different from that perspective.
Okay. I've got to say, I do like the assessments, the external assessments that go on, because basically I didn't have any assessments. I don't know, just blogged my way through it, I suppose.
I suppose from a frameworks perspective, you work with your training provider, but you work on the qualifications. So it's either your diploma in ICT practices, or your IT web telecoms competence qualifications, but they're awarded by an awarding organisation. So your likes of City and Guilds or Pearson are sort of the main people in the frame for delivering that. So at the end of the standards side of things, the framework side of things within Wales, you would get a separate knowledge certificate. You would get your competence certificate, because it's a separate qualification. If you needed your English, maths, ICT, you get certificates for each of those, and then you would get an overarching certificate of apprenticeship. So that's sort of the main difference. Whereas with standards, you go through, you do your learning, and then you get the certificate of apprenticeship at the end.
Okay. And with regards to funding, I mean, we saw a website there for the Institute of Apprenticeships, and there was some funding there. You did mention there were differences between England and Wales. Is the Institute of Apprenticeships all of the UK, or is it just England? And does the funding just apply from that particular part? Does it apply to just England or everywhere?
Yeah, those funding bands for standards relate to the apprenticeships delivered in England. So there's a funding band attached to each of the apprenticeship programs. So the ICT level 3 that I pulled up on screen there is £15,000. That doesn't mean that you get £15,000. That will be withdrawn from your levy pot, or it will be drawn from government funding to pay the training provider and the Endpoint Assessment organisation for the delivery of the apprenticeship. For employers that don't pay into the levy, there is a contribution that you would make towards that funding. So there would be a financial contribution that you would put in towards the training. Again, Gordon's going to correct me if I'm wrong, so that the training providers are much closer to the detail on this one, but it's a 5% contribution in England towards an apprenticeship if you don't pay into the levy. But there are incentives, some of which were relaunched a few weeks ago, that means that by taking apprentices on who are under 24, for example, or in certain regions, there are funding opportunities from LEPs and all sorts of incentive pots that mean anywhere between, I've seen up to £5,000 in certain regions, depending on the LEP, and local funding available on top of the central government incentives. So there are kind of pots of money that you can draw back from to support the delivery of the apprenticeship in the workplace.
And so from, obviously, in England, it's administered by the Education and Skills Funding Agency. And so that 5% that Tony was mentioning, there is a certain amount of that goes over to the devolved nations to support their apprenticeships, plus the additional funding that the respective governments will provide. And it's typically sort of a set payment for the apprenticeship that goes to your training provider, so that the training provider has a contract with the government to provide the cost of the training.
Okay, and so if you have an apprentice maybe that lives in Wales and the company is in England, all the other way around. How does that work? Is it where the company's based, or where the apprentices lives, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's a bit of a there's a little bit of leeway. I can tell this from experience, where we've had an organisation that is England based. So effectively, all their apprentices should be in England. It goes on where the apprentice lives. So those of you know North Wales. So we've got sort of the Chester side, and then we've got Saltney and Saltney Ferry, literally just over the border. So that's Wales, but you've got the learners living there and actually working in England. So from that side of things, they would be following an apprenticeship standard, because that's how their organisation would be funded, because they're an English-based company. If you had an apprentice living in England, just over the border, so say they're living in Chester, and their organisation is in Wrexham, they could be following the apprenticeship framework, the Welsh apprenticeship framework, and there wouldn't be a problem with that, because even though it's based on where the apprentice lives, there's not a problem with them coming over the border. The only thing you need to be mindful of is that if you're in England, if you're an English organisation, and you have apprentices in Scotland, and you want them to follow the Scottish qualifications, or you're an English-based company and you have them in Wales and you want them to follow the Welsh qualification, you won't receive any government funding for those.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
but unfortunately, those rules do change or get tweaked year on year. So around a month from now, we should be due another kind of funding bit of funding guidance. I would strongly advise that if you work with your training provider, someone like Gordon, for example, and GK would be able to help you out and advise you based on the current government funding rules, because those are the ones that will apply to your apprentice from the moment they start on their apprenticeship program. And if you're a large employer, then you may even be allocated an account manager by the ESFA in England, and they will help you and support you through the best use of your funding pot.
Okay, and with regard to standards, then BCS have got a lot of standards and stuff there, which is great to see. Do those transfer over to Wales as well? I know that the whole thing is completely different in Wales, but do we draw on those standards and make use of them as part of the apprenticeship? So if you want to do a bit of DevOps or something, we pick and choose the bits that we need?
Not typically, as far as I'm aware. I certainly haven't come across any examples of it. I'm speaking to two employers at the moment who want to mirror the English apprenticeship model in an overseas territory. And there's nothing that stops us technically from supporting them to do that, but they're effectively putting their learners through a model that looks almost identical to the apprenticeship delivery, including as much as 20% off the job training, and then mirroring the endpoint assessment process, but paying for that commercially. So, and ultimately, the ESFA have agreed that if somebody pays for the endpoint assessment commercially, that they would certificate, they would send a kind of IFATE, formal apprenticeship certificate out there, provided the learner can demonstrate they've been through effectively an English apprenticeship program anywhere in the world. That's really uncommon. And in terms of kind of translating that into delivery in Wales, as Gordon said, quite often it's fundable depending on location and the amount of time that the apprentice spends in one location or the other, where they live, what their employer does, where the employer base is, so that there may be opportunities there, but I genuinely don't think that it's been tested, as far as I'm aware, or delivered over the Welsh border that I'm aware, to any great extent.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else has got any questions. Please just type them in now, but if not, in the meantime, thank you both. That was a really interesting discussion. Got a lot out of it. I completely agree that apprenticeships are an exceedingly valuable way forward. You know, having done one myself, I can see that why would you go to university basically when you can get this done instead? So yeah, thank you very much, gents. It was a really good evening, and I think we all got a lot out of it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So with that, unless there's any last minute questions, I'd like to say thank you, and yeah, I'll shut the meeting down. Thank you, gentlemen, and hope to see you all again soon.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye.